Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, The State of Trade, the Economics of Green Supply Chains. This webinar is an April event of the State of Trade webinar series, a monthly series offering timely insights into the rapidly changing world of international trade. And before we begin, let's cover a few housekeeping items. If you look at your screen, you'll see multiple application widgets that you can use. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the additional materials on the bottom left. You'll also find a few flexport.org resources in the bottom left corner, including a carbon footprint analysis, more information about the impact dashboard the flexport.org team has built, and information on the services they provide to companies that donate their goods and products to nonprofits and communities. We invite you to join us on April 21st for our Customs Broker RFP process webinar, and you can find a link to that on the top right. You are welcome to ask questions through the Q&A widget, which is on the right. We'll try to answer as many of those as we can during the webinar, time permitting. We also would appreciate it if you'd share with us other webinar topics you'd like us to explore, or any comments you might have about the program. Our goal, of course, is to share valuable insights. A quick survey is on the bottom right, where you can tell us where you'd like those insights. And finally, an on-demand version of this webinar will be available shortly after we conclude and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. All right, and now for the lawyers. Please do keep in mind that all information provided in this webinar is presented based on the situation at the time and may not be customized to your specific situation. All right, we got a good show for you today, some excellent experts. Before we talk about the experts, I'm Phil Levy, I'm Chief Economist at Flexport, but with me, we've got Susie Schoenberg, who is Senior Director and Head of Flexport.org, which is Flexport's sustainability and social good initiative that works with nonprofits who need to ship goods to areas of need, and companies that have excess goods to donate, and companies looking to cut carbon emissions from their shipping, perhaps most relevant for our discussion today. Before Flexport, Susie spent time as a social worker in Germany, co-founded and led Social Force, a startup focused on technology's impact on society, and worked on business analysis and corporate strategy at Deutsche Bahn. She holds an MBA from the University of California, Berkeley's Haas School of Business. I'm surrounded by bears today, and a BS in economics from Humboldt University of Berlin. Susie, glad to have you with us.
Pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone.
We are also very fortunate to have with us Joe Shapiro, who is an associate professor at UC Berkeley in agriculture and resource economics and the Department of Economics. He helps to edit a number of prominent economic journals. He's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a research associate at the Energy Institute at Haas. He researches questions such as how international trade policy and environmental policy interact, what are the costs, benefits, and incidents of environmental policies, and how important are the investments that people make to protect themselves against air pollution and climate change. He has also been an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at Yale and holds a PhD in economics from MIT, master's degrees from Oxford and LSE, and a bachelor's degree from Stanford. Joe, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks, I'm excited to be here.
All right, let's quickly run through our agenda for today. We're going to discuss why are trade and the environment connected, each clearly an important issue on its own, but what is the intersection of the two? We're going to talk about how they've intersected in the past, and then move on to how we see these policies changing. What will you potentially face as a business? And then directly address how businesses can build and leverage green supply chains. And then with whatever remaining time we might have, we'll turn to questions and answers. Before we delve into this substance, we are going to do the first of our polls. This is where you all sit up straight and get a chance to join in. So we'd like to ask all of you to please let us know, are environmental considerations part of your company's day-to-day decision-making? And here are the choices we're offering to answer. First, yes, it's part of our broader company mission. Or, yes, for our sustainability team, but it's localized within the company. No, but we are investigating the topic. Or, no, environmental considerations don't play a role in our business operations, at least at this time. So if I can ask you to just take a moment and say which best describes the situation for your business. We will tally up the answers and at least get a start to see where everybody's coming from. And this is the first of several polls that we will field during today's session. So thank you for those of you who have voted. We're starting to get some good votes in. Let me give you just a moment or two more to make up your minds, and then I will show us the results. All right. Getting some good responses. Going once, going twice. Survey says, all right, so we get almost half saying that it's part of the broader company mission, with then, I guess that's about, it was risky to do math on the fly, but about a third saying not really part of things, and the remainder saying it's somewhat localized. All right, well, this is a chance to explore these issues, and so we'll delve into these things for you, and you can see what you think. All right, so let's jump into the substance. Question is, why are trade and the environment connected? And just as background for this, and a little bit of a reason why we're taking this on today, there has certainly been a renewed vigor in addressing these issues. Not only the issues individually, so here we show you a headline about the U.S. officially rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, but also taking on this intersection between trade and the environment. We'll talk more later on about the possibility of carbon border adjustment mechanisms or taxes. That's an issue of discussion. You've actually had a measure put, the EU has had a carbon trading scheme for quite some time, but is now thinking about sort of border implications. And in fact, I think it's because she heard we were doing this webinar, but the U.S. trade rep is scheduled to speak tomorrow about the greening of U.S. trade policy. Cannot see whether or not she is on among the audience. But in any case, let me now turn to you, Joe, and ask, we can take as given that trade is important on its own and the environment is important. Why should we be thinking about this intersection? What links these two issues?
Thanks. About half of my research is on the interaction, so I'm probably not impartial in thinking it's an exciting and interesting combination. But this slide is showing a graph I made. It's going to show up in a book chapter in a few months on all production and transportation for every good around the world, and asked what share of global pollution emissions are crossing international borders embodied in the supply chains of traded goods. So actually a large share of emissions associated with trade are not that coal or gas is crossing borders, but instead that firms are using electricity to produce goods, or they're buying domestically sourced aluminum that was produced with coal and electricity. And we calculate that between a fourth and a third of all global pollution emissions around the world have to do with international trade. This graph is just one measure of pollution, which is nitrogen oxides emissions. But we did the same calculation for carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, a number of other pollutants, and the pattern is pretty similar. It's a large share. It's also a growing share. These data stopped in 2009 for academic publication reasons I won't get into, but as trade is growing and global value chains are getting longer, this share tends to be rising over time. One statistic that's not shown in this graph is that the International Energy Agency every year measures carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel combustion, and they break it out into a half dozen different categories. And if you plot each of those global sectors over time, by far the fastest growing sector is actually international air and sea transportation. Carbon and dioxide emissions from that part of the global economy are going much faster than electricity, heating, production, or any other broad industry. It's a small share overall, but it's getting more important over time. So I guess one important reason is it's a modest share, but it's growing over time. You could also think about policy like international trade agreements, NAFTA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and other multilateral agreements. They often have side chapters on the environment. And a lot of those side chapters have to do with coordinating policy and collecting data. But I think there's a perception that environment is growing more important in trade policy. As Phil mentioned, the European Union has said they're going to create a border carbon adjustment in the next few years. And Every year, the Trade Policy Committee of the EU Parliament has Trade Policy Day. So I testified on some research I've been doing in this area to that commission a few months ago, and they decided to rename it Sustainable Trade Policy Day because they noticed all of the trade policies they were discussing had to do with the environment. And they were really thinking about, after COVID, if they're recreating trade policy, how can they redevelop it to be more friendly to the environment? Phil, do you want to take charge of this poll or the slides?
Actually, before we get to the poll, I wanted to ask you another question about all this, which is that there will be a poll coming up. Everybody can sort of be alert. But one of the things that often motivates some of these discussions and some of the intersection is this idea of a race to the bottom. That when people start thinking about trade and the environment, that, if it turns out that, pollution standards are really low in one country, industry will flock there and it will undermine standards in another country. How much, in terms of empirical work, is that a well-founded concern?
Yeah, I'm an economist, so I have to say yes on one hand and no on the other. There's a lot of research on that idea and a lot of concern around it. There is definitely evidence that if a local area has stricter environmental policy, it discourages investment in production and economic activity from industries where that regulation is particularly costly. For example, in the US, the Clean Air Act has this policy called non-attainment, where certain counties that are too polluted have much more strict environmental policy. And there's a string of really influential research papers showing that when a county gets more regulation in that way, there is less investment, and firms that were operating there tend to be more likely to move abroad. So there is direct evidence that regulation is not free, it creates real costs. On the other hand, there's also a lot of research trying to say, look, developing countries have weaker environmental regulation. Do we see a lot of evidence that energy-intensive and polluting industries are more likely to locate in those countries, that it's giving them a strong incentive? And it's much harder to find clear evidence of that kind of international specialization because of environmental policy. I think the prevailing feeling is that when you try to measure the costs of environmental policy, it's very small relative to the costs of differences in wages or capital accessibility. In accounting measures, industrial firms often report it's maybe 0.5% of total cost or 0.75% of total costs in the US, where policy is pretty stringent. So it's not that it's irrelevant, and there's definitely cases where there's evidence of it on the margin. And I guess the other sense is that if countries are deciding where to specialize production, energy-intensive companies are also often capital-intensive. And you might find the weakest environmental policy in the lowest income countries, but it's hard to access capital and skilled workers, and those move almost in opposite directions to environmental policy, partly because people value having a clean environment. The Bay Area has strict environmental policy, people value the air quality. So that's the sense in which it's yes and no. It's not irrelevant, but it doesn't seem to be the leading driver of activity, especially across countries.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. All right, we are going to go to the next poll because we're going to ask people, or that'll get us into our discussion more of how these have intersected. So, second question for our audience, asking about what your company does to measure its carbon footprint. Do you measure your carbon footprint once a year, quarterly, monthly, real time? Not yet, but we plan to, or probably not, which is a basic way of saying no, we don't measure our carbon footprint. We're not actually passing any judgment on any of this. We just want to know what you're doing. So we've already got a whole bunch of good responses. Thank you. Let me give a couple moments more. To the best of your knowledge, how often does your company measure its carbon footprint, if at all? Let's let a few more come in. This is great. Okay. Going once, going twice. Survey says the winner is probably not, followed by not yet, but we plan to, and then once a year. Susie, let me just sort of get you back on the line for a second. Does this surprise you at all? Is this sort of what you are seeing as you talk to companies?
My answer would also be yes and no. So on the one hand, I'm surprised given that this topic is just gaining more relevance. And we also see that reporting requirements are increasing. On the other hand, I'm not surprised at all, because if you think about the carbon footprint of an organization, typically we think about the direct carbon emissions caused by the operations of the company, but then there are also many indirect carbon emissions that can be associated to your business activity. And assessing those can be quite complex, right? Because you need information from your suppliers. If you're a global organization, there are many different data points that you need access to, and that can be really, really complicated. And so totally understandable that it will be hard for companies to kind of get the full transparency. And I'm just pleased to see that a third, has this on the agenda and knows that this is a topic, that might become relevant for them.
Right. And we'll talk a little bit more later about sort of what one can do and what businesses can do. All right. So let's go back then to discussing how we've seen the intersection between trade and environmental issues. Joe, we started to talk about this a little bit, where we've seen, as you mentioned, at the margin sometimes of trade agreements, where you will have, say, a side letter to NAFTA. It got more incorporated under the USMCA. What is your overall assessment of the way environmental issues have been treated, and what, is it sufficient? Has it been good? How would you characterize it?
I guess one could take two perspectives. One is to ask, if you're an organization or business person focused on environment and energy issues, how does trade affect what you think about? And then the other perspective would be, if you're a trade supply chain executive, how does the environment and energy change what you think about, and how do policy interact with those? The graph here on the left is a simulation of global climate change and how policy would affect that. And I think this graph helps me think about some broader issues and how trade and the environment have interacted and how they may interact. So the different solid lines you see there are predictions of the world's temperature under different projections of business growth. So the red prediction is rapid growth in emissions, rapid growth in technology, rapid GDP growth around the world, and that would lead to pretty quick increases in global climate. And then the blue line is a more modest emissions, especially in developing countries, is a little less rapid. So those are purely scientific calculations. And then if you squint, you can see these dashed red and blue lines just below them. And so those dashed lines were predictions made around a decade ago, which say, if in the year 2009, the US had implemented a stringent cap and trade bill, it was the Waxman-Markey bill, it passed the House but not the Senate, how would the global climate have changed? How would it have been different from the business as usual scenario with no policy? And I said you have to squint because it's not a vast change. One country taking a moderate policy, and that policy was proposed, it wasn't even implemented. Alone, that's not going to solve the world's climate change concerns. Instead, I think the way many people think about climate change and other environmental problems is that they do not respect political boundaries. The graph on the right is showing emissions from nitrogen oxides pollutions. Those gray areas are power plants and large emission sources, and the red lines are showing wind. And pollution doesn't pay attention to where political boundaries are, be it city, state, county, country. And so solving those problems often requires coordination across states or across countries. So the graph on the left is about climate, the graph on the right is about air pollution. And a way many people think about climate change is that it's going to require many countries to invest in clean energy and climate policy. For one country to do it alone might not be fully effective, and it can be more costly. It can decrease competitiveness. So I think an increasing share of the proposals to deal with climate change involve using trade as some way of coordinating. Some of those proposals are like the EU suggestion I mentioned to create a border carbon adjustment that would be like a tariff proportional to the carbon emissions on imported goods. And then there are other proposals that are perhaps more in my orbit as an academic and less in the practical world today. We tend to think about things that might be on the front page in 5 or 15 or 25 years, not today. But for example, Bill Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize in economics a couple years ago for his research on climate change. in his proposal, he gave it in an address to the American Economic Association and then published in the top journal in the field. It's to create this idea called climate clubs, where he suggests the WTO could essentially rewrite its charter to say that if you want the benefits of free trade, then you also need some kind of minimal climate change policy. That's getting increasing academic discussion. When I was talking to EU people, they're aware of it. It's not on the front page of policy. But I think so far, environmental policies have not been the primary driver of trade. It's not likely they will ever be the main driver. But if you think about how to achieve coordination across US states, we have the federal government that helps coordinate across states. But then if you ask, what is a way to get the US and China and the EU and India all to cooperate on climate change? It's harder to achieve cooperation just through voluntary means. And it's unappealing to use sticks like threats and force or anything like that to get cooperation. And so I think the discussion instead has been about, are there ways to use trade policy and cooperation in economic terms to help achieve more cohesive trade policies? Also to help address climate cooperation.
Let me ask a question about that, which is that if we sort of think, so often you get developing countries arguing that, hey, we see a natural progression here, that as countries get wealthier, one of the things they do is they want better environmental quality. In econ parlance, it's a luxury good. You get richer, you do more of this. But that they observe and they say, well, the U.S. had its dirty period and Europe had its dirty period, and then they develop their industries as they went there. They say it's unfair to ask developing countries to adopt these policies when they're still at that poorer earlier stage. Is the idea here to do a development appropriate level of environmental policy, or is there a common environmental policy? How should we think about that?
Fairness is an incredibly important question in designing trade policies, where there's a lot of concern about unequal effects on low-skilled versus high-skilled workers. It's also incredibly important in thinking about environmental policies, both for the reasons you mentioned, and also because in most data, low-income households spend a much higher share of their budget on energy. And so there's a lot of concern that environmental policies would be unequal and create a disproportionate burden on low-income groups. Deciding what's fair and not is not my comparative advantage as an economist. We tend to focus on saying, here are the consequences of policies you could create, here's who they're good for, here's who they're bad for. I think if you look at predictions, though, the groups that are going to bear the largest cost of environmental problems like air pollution and climate change are low-income countries, and especially low-income consumers in those countries. It's harder for them to migrate away from disasters. It's more expensive to build seawalls. Fewer people in low-income countries have air conditioning. All the ways you can think about adapting to live in a world with more environmental problems, it's harder to do those in low-income countries. So when there have been multilateral negotiations like the Paris Agreement, a way that low-income countries were brought on board for recent agreements like the Paris Agreement, and they were not with the Kyoto Protocol, was partly realizing this is a cost to everybody. If we don't coordinate, it's not just the US that's going to suffer, it's also India and China and Mexico. So it's actually in their very strong interest to about it. Now, there's a fairness question. Who's supposed to lead? How large should the costs be? And to some extent, that's a political and an ethical question, which is extremely important. Other people have thought a lot about it. But I think the idea of the Kyoto Protocol from 1997, that developing countries could just be left out, I think they're starting to realize that's not even in their interest because it's a serious problem for them too.
Do you think that there's largely agreement on... Oh, yeah, please, Susie, jump in.
Yeah, if I could just add also from the business perspective, and I would love to hear your thoughts as well. Is, it's also presenting opportunities, right? So for companies that want to develop products that make it easier or cheaper for, people and companies in those regions to actually, green their operations or make sure that they can reduce their energy consumption, whatever it might be. I feel it's also presenting an opportunity, and regulation could help to also create incentives, right, for those companies to kind of take advantage of those opportunities. So while, we talk about the policy perspective a lot, I also feel that, we can think about those policies as positive incentives. Would you agree, Joe?
Innovation is an incredibly powerful force to solve social problems, and regulation has enormous potential to spur innovation. If you look at some of the biggest changes in clean energy around the world in the last few decades, they have to do with decreasing the cost of solar cell production. A lot of that had to do with policy and innovation and returns to scale of plants in China that are exporting around the world. How did they develop that? Some of it was innovation happening at universities in the US and EU. Also, the decreasing cost of batteries for electric vehicles, the decreasing cost of wind energy, and policy has a really important role to spur the private sector to make those innovations. There's a good feature happening now, which is that countries are getting anxious that they're going to miss the boat in creating green industry. And so you see the Biden administration today trying to think about how can they spur investment in innovation and green energy. China's been thinking about that for a long time. If you think about air pollution, the same kind of debates happen when air pollution regulation becomes more stringent. Initially, there's a great concern of how costly it will be. Engineers and entrepreneurs find ways to clean up pollution that decreases costs and can still benefit the environment. So that definitely happens on its own, and then policy has a really important role to encourage it, to support basic research and have the really broad, deep innovations, and then firms create the innovations that bring R&D to market.
That's right. Let me just interject here because I want to get a reaction. This is my take a bit on some of the background that brings this, because in terms of the relative emphasis given to trade versus environmental, and what some of the tensions have been that we're trying to overcome as we think about this. So I think if you look in the past, there's in addition to the statement that I made, where developing countries thought they were being sort of unfairly burdened with things that really should only be applied to developed countries. There's also been a concern, which is that this is really a method of disguised protectionism. And when I say this, they're talking about something just like the carbon border adjustment tax, where you mentioned it briefly, but just to be clear about what we're talking about, the EU Parliament has tasked, I think, a research group to come up probably within a couple of years with some kind of a solution that if other countries do not apply appropriate carbon measures, they would be hit, as you said, with a tax which will look very much like a tariff, because it'll be a tax on imports, which effectively will act as if they have done that. You've got a lot of countries, and actually not just developing. Australia came right out and said, we think this is protectionism, pure and simple. And I think the U.S. has expressed some concern. So that's one of the concerns that's been there. I think from the other side, it seems that you've had complaints that it has not been a balancing act between trade and the environment, that because of the way trade agreements were often written, you have some classic cases where the things that were codified as enforceable were the trade parts. And so if the environmental measures sort of contradicted those, they were just declared invalid, that countries were in violation, they could be retaliated against. And you've had some classic questions. Here I toss up the example of tuna dolphin, which is, at least as a trade economist, this is what one often thinks of, is some of these things where it's a concern about sort of that this is countries imposing their standards. That was an instance where the U.S. had strong beliefs about the way that that fishermen should go after tuna and do it in ways that would not harm dolphins. And the claim was that the attempt was to not take tuna that was made with objectionable practices. This was a sort of famously contentious case. Now we're not talking about border spillovers. I realize this is all a hodgepodge, but at least in my mind, this is the hodgepodge of trade and the environment. Joe, can you help me sort this out a little bit? Are there sort of clear delineations we should be thinking about where some of these are transboundary spillovers and some aren't? Is there a way to make sense of all this?
Yeah, these are great and important academic and policy questions. You know, when I started graduate school in economics, I felt like people were speaking a different language, and I asked myself, why is everybody speaking in jargon? And now I've spoken that language enough, I forget what's jargon and what's not. But academics often use the word linkage to describe the idea that you would use trade to achieve other ends, like use trade policy to solve human rights problems, or use trade policy to solve environmental problems. And a lot of trade researchers worry about linkage because the world has achieved an incredible degree of coordination. Tariffs have fallen dramatically over the last half century, and the WTO and GATT and other trade agreements have achieved that cooperation. That has not happened in other domains like the environment. And so there's a lot of anxiety. If we start using trade policy to pursue other ends, maybe we will lose some of the cooperation and trade. At the same time, that's happening. And as you mentioned, there's great concern that using trade to achieve environmental ends is just protectionism in disguise. There are academic papers, including mine, which show that it is in a country's incentive to use an environmental policy for protectionism. So I think academics would have no argument. I certainly wouldn't, because I've published papers saying there are easy ways to use an environmental policy to achieve trade protection purposes. In fact, the first time I was presenting research in this area as a graduate student, I was cautious. It wasn't an especially active area of research. I wasn't sure people thought it was exciting. I was a grad student at MIT, and I was walking through Harvard Square, and they had this little periodical store there, and they were displaying the Financial Times. And the #1 lead article that day was about the European Union trying to add air transportation to its cap and trade market, the emissions trading system. And there was this incredible blowback around the world. Russia threatened to cancel the rights of European airlines to fly through Russian airspace. Brazil was going to cancel Airbus orders. And there was a great quote saying, trade policy disguised under environmental umbrellas. And so in my presentation, I actually held up that copy of the Financial Times and said, this really matters. People are really worried we're going to ruin trade policy by worrying about the environment. Given that that is a concern, the legal and policy folks have tried to take many steps to make that infeasible. I think the most important is that there are arguments about whether it is legal under WTO rules to use trade policies to achieve environmental ends. But I think the consensus is it is only allowed if a country treats the environment domestically the same as the environment abroad. So it would violate WTO protocol if you applied an environmental policy to imports, but you did not apply it to domestic production. That has been tested in various guises, but I think that's the way in which policy has tried to prevent using environmental policy to achieve protectionist ends. At the same time, one of the other points you mentioned is hidden policies that are harder to regulate. International trade policy has mostly focused on tariffs, which are very easy to measure. There's a tariff rate on a given product. It's a number. It's easy to see what that number is. On the other hand, non-tariff barriers, which include any policy barriers to trade that aren't tariffs, those are growing dramatically over time. And many people think it's because the WTO has been able to regulate tariffs and has had a much harder time regulating non-tariff barriers. And so there is a fear there are many non-tariff barriers that look like environmental policies that are restricting trade. And that's a harder problem to solve. People are wrestling with it, but I don't think there's a single solution.
And before we move on to sort of what we see coming down the road, and we're going to turn to Susie for that, but before we get there, you've written about an environmental bias of trade. What is that?
Thank you. This is one of my favorite graphs ever, although I'm sure it looks somewhat dry and uncompelling relative to maps and pictures that you might see. But let me just quickly tell the backstory of this graph. There's a lot of discussion of carbon border adjustments or carbon tariffs, which mean if a country had a climate change policy and were worried, they would just start to import energy-intensive goods like steel and aluminum. They could adjust their tariffs to be higher on energy-intensive goods. And that would solve this worry about a country that tries to address climate change is going to decrease its competitiveness. Gee, every country already has tariffs that are different across different industries. Maybe countries already have that kind of trade policy that benefits the environment and nobody noticed. Maybe countries already have higher tariffs on energy-intensive goods. So I looked around the world and said, for every country, let's look at the tariffs that they applied to different goods and ask are they charging higher tariffs on dirty goods? And it turns out exactly the opposite happens. They're charging higher tariffs on clean goods and lower tariffs on dirty goods. So if you look at this graph, when you go to the right, we've got the most energy intensive goods with the highest carbon emissions rate. And those have the lowest levels of protection, the lowest tariffs. And then when you go on the left, those are clean goods that emit very little carbon per dollar of output, and they have very high tariffs. It turns out this happens literally in every country around the world. It's been happening for at least 20 to 30 years. It happens in cooperative tariffs, non-cooperative tariffs, it happens in non-tariff barriers. It's systematic. Surprising, this is what I was testifying about to the European Union, and I've been writing a lot about recently. If you're interested, I could go into the details of why this is happening. But one consequence of it is that trade policy today is actually accelerating climate change because it is encouraging trade and production and consumption in the dirty goods that have lower levels of protection. And it is discouraging production, consumption, and trade in clean goods that have high levels of protection.
I am interested in why. Is this deliberate, or is this because it sort of correlates with something else?
I'm pretty sure it's not deliberate because I've talked to a lot of government policymakers in the US and EU and Australia, and nobody realized this was happening. I think, not to be too self-promoting, but I think before my paper, this was just not a recognized fact. Nobody had tested about it before. And I look at many explanations for why this could be happening. And the leading reason is that trade policy is driven by political concerns. And some of those political forces are very strongly associated with pollution intensity. And the one that seems to be most important is how upstream an industry is in a supply chain. So there's another piece of jargon. But an upstream firm or industry is mostly selling goods to other firms. A downstream firm or industry is mostly selling to final consumers like us. And it's been true for at least a half a century that countries place low tariffs on upstream goods. So steel, cement, petroleum, aluminum, those tend to have very low tariffs, and they're mostly goods that are sold to other firms. And then downstream goods, pencils, glasses, cigarettes, those tend to have fairly high tariffs. And why does that happen? Economists and policymakers refer to that as tariff escalation. As you go from the most upstream to the most downstream goods, tariffs tend to get higher. And a reason people think that happens is that every firm and industry wants to lobby policymakers to have high protection on their own goods to protect them from foreign competition. But they also want to have low levels of trade protection on their inputs so they can buy goods at low costs. And that means that everybody is lobbying politicians to have the lowest tariffs on the most upstream goods and also the dirtiest goods. If you actually put a number on how upstream different industries are, it's almost a one-to-one correlation between upstreamness and pollution intensity. And then the only groups that are around to tell politicians, let's have low protection on the downstream goods, are final consumers like us, and there's 300 million final consumers in the economy, and they're hard to organize. And that just means upstream goods have low protection. They also emit a lot of pollution.
Yeah, that was one of my...
a lot of jargon, but that's the short version.
No, that's good. You were talking about your early recollections. One of mine from one of my stints in the White House was, if you want to get somebody to laugh at you and think of you as a hopeless academic, you start talking about things like consumer interests. That it sort of marks you indelibly as naive. Didn't totally stop me, but it does emphasize your point about where the relative power tends to come in as one sets these things. Susie, I want to make sure we bring that is great. So we sort of set the stage by talking about what has happened with intersection. When businesses look ahead, when they think, what's coming, what do they foresee? What do you foresee?
Totally. So I feel what we have heard so far is, one, that trade really matters for the climate change discussion, but also that the climate change discussion influences trade policies. But for some reason, there haven't been efficient measures, right, that could be implemented in a coordinated and global way. So the big question is, why would this change, and what would we anticipate? And I would like to start with this first question. Why do we think that the landscape might change and hence also influence businesses? And I feel there are two important questions to look at. One is, we know that in the past, it wasn't easy to assess emissions in certain areas. And if you can't measure something, right, you also can't really optimize it or improve it. And this has changed. There are many different reasons for why it's now easier to kind of have access to kind of the data and to make sure that we can actually measure and attribute the emissions from transportation. The second, I think, question or hint, that we got that something might change is there has been a lot of debate about how to kind of split emissions between countries. So for everyone who doesn't know, a lot of the climate agreements, the international ones, work based on national greenhouse gas inventories. So that means that on a country level, they assess their national greenhouse gas inventory, and then they set certain goals for their own inventory for how they want to reduce the emissions. And then overall, on a global standard, there's a global emissions goal that, given based on the Paris Agreement, we want to hit as a global economy. But there are certain activities like international trade, where let's say a ship travels from China to the US, and the question is, how do you split those emissions? Do you split it in half between the two regions? Should the owner of the ship actually be responsible for those emissions, right? If you think about where's this company headquartered? And there were a lot of difficult questions that couldn't be solved. Now that the pressure has increased, and as Joe has described earlier, it's pretty clear that kind of there will be large costs if we don't tackle this topic. There is now, a bigger willingness to actually work those topics out and to implement policies accordingly. Just a last note on the cost, and then I will talk about the future. In 2020, the damages of extreme kind of weather events in the United States amounted to $95 billion. And that are only the damages, basically, or the events that caused more than $1 billion of damages that were counted. So, $95 billion were lost last year in the US due to damages to homes, businesses, crop infrastructure, and this is not even counting all the indirect effects. So it's becoming pretty clear that this is a costly issue that needs to be addressed. So I kind of picked three changes that we anticipate. We already talked a lot about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Maybe just as a reminder, it's likely to come in 2023. We expect that in June, the European Union will present more details around how will this be measured and how will they really implement this potential change. And the reason why they're doing it is that right now, the emissions from importing goods are not being part of those equations, right? Those national greenhouse gas inventories that I just mentioned. And so that's something that they want to change. And how it will work is they will basically assess how much it would cost, someone, if you're importing a good, how much it would have cost you to produce the goods applying the European environmental laws and apply this cost as a carbon tax. They want to make sure that companies producing in the European Union don't get a disadvantage by the measures of the EU Green Deal. So those are policies that the European Union will implement to be carbon neutral by 2050. We think that there at least will be some likelihood that some measures will be implemented and that we might see similar actions in other regions. The second area where we might see new goals that are impacting companies that are importing and exporting is based on the transportation agencies of the United Nations. So for example, the IMO, we have seen that IMO 2020 was implemented that focused on sulfur oxide emissions, but they also recently set goals for reducing CO2 emissions. The goal is to reduce the CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030 compared to 2050, excuse me. And so there will probably be requirements for the asset owners of the ships, etc., so that we also will see, just like the landscape changing, and that everyone in the global supply chain will be required to meet kind of new standards. And lastly, the SEC just announced that there will be a specific team, a task force, that will be specialized on climate and ESG, so environmental, social governance kind of criteria, And so that also means the reporting standards will be increasing. We already know that in the European Union, companies are required to kind of report and measure their carbon footprint in a certain way. But even in the US, they're now making sure that whenever you make a certain environmental claim, that this is true, and it will be a larger focus. I will turn it over to Joe for any additional thoughts.
Joe, what do you see coming down the line?
I'm doing a lot of research these days on international transportation in the US and thinking about electric vehicles and transportation regulation. I think I have the sense that's probably going to be intra-national policy than an international policy, just because the technology is a lot easier for trucks and trains than for boats and planes. On the other hand, reporting is relatively cheap. I certainly appreciate it because a lot of my research is using data from companies like many of yours that are summarizing their carbon emissions and how they affect the environment. Sometimes it's worth asking what all this adds up to and if it's pennies on the dollar for trade policy. And one statistic I didn't mention is the last graph I showed that had that line in scatterplot about trade policy. If you add that up and say, what is the dollar value of the effect of trade policy on carbon emissions? That's the graph. It's about a $600 billion per year subsidy, which is to say trade policy today is the same as if the world was spending $600 billion a year to encourage carbon emissions. And a lot of my macroeconomics colleagues see these kind of numbers and they say billions, schmillions, we think in trillions, so these numbers are not. But as a benchmark, if you look at the world's largest climate change policies, like the European Union's emissions trading system or a US cap and trade bill, they would have pretty similar impacts on carbon emissions as this kind of change in policy. So I think it's easy to see these as small changes on the fringe. On the other hand, that's what environmental policies are doing today and all starting to scale up.
Yeah, and there's also talk of things like environmental goods agreements, which would be sort of liberalization, try to do maybe the kind of things you talked about, whether it's solar, which we've gone in the other direction, and taxed. So, all right. Interesting to look out at what's coming. We're going to talk in a minute about what businesses can do, but first we're going to go to our final poll, and we're going to take on, in particular, this idea that we've discussed several times about carbon border adjustment taxes. So we say here, if countries adopt carbon border adjustment taxes, this would be, and then here are your choices: good for the environment and good for my business, good for the environment, bad for my business, a vehicle for protectionism in disguise, I don't think this is really going to happen, or something I haven't yet thought much about. So, and of course, we don't say which country we're talking about here, but the most obvious choice is the European Union, which has already talked about this. But let me ask you to take your best guess about what this would mean for both the environment and for you if we were to see these carbon border adjustment taxes, where a country or an entity like the European Union decides to apply taxes at the border on goods that are being brought in to adjust for whether or not carbon was properly priced or regulated. So let me give a moment or two for you to think this through, to sort of give your responses, see what you think. A little more challenging, but again, choices: good for the environment, good for my business; good for the environment, bad for my business; a vehicle for protectionism in disguise; don't really believe this is going to happen, or haven't yet thought enough about. So, all right. Thank you for those who have voted. Let me wait and see if we can get a few more responses. Your input is always very much appreciated. It's one of the things we truly enjoy, is seeing what the audience thinks. So another moment or two. There we go. Some good levels of response. Going once, going twice, and here's what you guys think. I think narrowly winning is good for the environment, bad for my business, followed by something I haven't yet thought much about, and then after that, good for the environment and good for my business. So, and unless there is a belief this is going to happen, so very few people who think this is unlikely, and even fewer who think it's a vehicle for protectionism in disguise. All right, thank you for that. Those are very interesting. That's a very interesting take on all of this. let's turn now for our sort of final segment before we have is, given this kind of environment, given what's happening, what can businesses do about this? How can they build and leverage green supply chains? Susie?
So our discussion in the prior section has probably shown that independent of international or national policies, there are already requirements that affect businesses today. And it doesn't matter if you're a B2C business, where of course we also know that consumers have high expectations now, and that the majority of consumers now expect companies actually to take environmental action. But even if you're in the B2B business, those requirements will kind of either trickle down from a policy perspective or kind of trickle up because, your kind of customers might react based on the pressure that they're getting from the end consumer. So it's definitely already a topic today. And I hope that with this last section, and we probably have about 5 minutes left, so I will be quick. And if there are questions, please feel free to reach out afterwards. Hopefully this section will help you to feel that no matter what's coming your way, that this can be good for your business and that you can prepare yourself and turn this into an opportunity. You will see that I'm a big optimist, and I believe that this issue and tackling kind of climate change can be good for all. First of all, I would like to highlight why sustainability can be good for a business. Overall, that's a big word. There are many different issues. Today we focused on climate and emissions a lot, but of course, also waste, some kind of water consumption is relevant for a company. How you treat your workforce is another big topic. And we also heard that kind of human rights is another topic that might be kind of covered by trade agreements. So it's a big landscape, but overall, if companies decide to make a dedicated and intentional effort to think about the sustainability of their business, that this can have a lot of positive effects. It can drive innovation, increase customer and employee loyalty, have a financial benefit. If you, for example, consume less electricity, it will also save you money. And it can be a competitive advantage if you start to act earlier than maybe your competitors. So let's walk through the steps a company can take if you're starting your journey and if you think about greening your supply chain. In the steps here, I will focus on transportation specifically, right? We learned that trade-related emissions come from producing your goods and transporting them. So again, it's a big topic, but let's see how we can make the assessment of transportation-related emissions really easy. I think the first step is to really make it, as I said, an intentional part of your decision-making. This can happen as part of the company mission. And we learned earlier that a lot of companies already defined this as a pillar of their company mission, but also you as an employee can decide to make this part of your job responsibility and think about how does it affect my day-to-day. And kind of maybe create a business case to show that this is a valuable investment or preventing future risk for your business. The second step is to really measure your emissions and establish a baseline so that you know where you are starting and that you can set goals efficiently. Ideally, you would work with your suppliers or vendors and partners so that it's becoming really easy for you and that you don't have to spend a lot of resources in order to do so. Tools right out there. And again, at the beginning, we said we also provide some resources. Once you know what your emissions are, you can create a plan to reduce emissions. If we are talking about transportation, measures could be, can you optimize your supply chain in a way that you use more ocean freight instead of air freight? Can you increase the utilization in your containers or increase the use of consolidation or alternative biofuels and options? So how can we think about the whole network? I talked about, the effect that we might see on carriers and asset owners. And lastly, we know that at least for international transportation, we still have to burn fuel to power the ships and planes. So there are also options to compensate all the emissions that you can't reduce. Studies have shown that we actually have to really, take CO2 out of the atmosphere and compensate our carbon emissions to actually really meet our carbon reduction goals. And many companies recently have also announced that they want to become carbon neutral in the next decade. And so you can invest into projects like carbon offsets, or you can also invest in carbon removal technologies. Again, I would highly encourage you to really think about, how can you use your vendors so that they need you to tackle some of those sustainability issues and do the work for you, to really define KPIs and make it part of your decision making. So the next time you might look at a quote or you try to kind of transport your goods, maybe you do not only consider cost in transit, the environmental impact, because we know that this has costs too.
That is great. Thank you. All right, we have time for one, maybe two questions. So if you have one that's burning, you can use the widget, and still there's time to get something in. The first question that I want to pose really to both of you is how we think about China. We've been talking a lot about the European Union and what they're doing with their carbon border adjustment taxes. We're familiar with the United States. China seems to sort of symbolize both a very large economy, but also a developing economy. We got a question about, is China exporting pollution? There's a story in today's Wall Street Journal about John Kerry vowing to take a hard line in climate talks with Chinese. Sometimes this is used as an argument for inaction, which is that if the Chinese don't change things, what difference is this going to make? We won't get all of these benefits. Joe, maybe I can start with you. As we think about sort of global measures, how could one think about China in this context as both a developing and a very large economy that has a large industrial sector?
Just to underscore the importance of the question, if you graph carbon emissions from different regions over time, the US and EU are largely flat over the last couple 10, 20 years, and you see China just rocketing up due to coal consumption and energy consumption. At the same time, today, China has the world's largest climate change policy. It has a series of cap and trade markets for CO2 that are pilots that are being merged. Climate change policies very seriously. There are no climate change policies around the world today that are anywhere in the ballpark of what researchers think would be efficient or optimal. Bill Nordhaus, I mentioned, won the Nobel Prize for his climate research. He thinks a carbon price of $40 to $60 a ton would be optimal. The world's average price today is $3 per ton. The EU is maybe 5 or 7. China is starting to inch up in that direction. It also doesn't want to disadvantage its competitiveness. So it's incredibly important. It's hard to know exactly what's going to happen.
So a follow-up question on this. We've sort of discussed various cap and trade policies. There's sort of tradable emissions in Europe. You discussed China doing this. How do you see the U.S.? We have a new administration in the U.S. How do you see this evolving, and how well do sort of the kinds of U.S. measures that we've discussed fit with these other measures?
I have to say, I recently read a fascinating story about how some of these negotiations have happened, is in Barack Obama's biography. And he just has this play-by-play of how climate negotiations have happened between countries that's really like a John Grisham novel for a few pages. That might not be happening again in the future. So the Biden administration is trying to use the tools that it has available, but a cap and trade market or a really stringent national policy would require legislative action that's not likely to happen. I will comment that every climate change bill proposed in Congress, every major bill has had a carbon border adjustment as part of it. And most people I've asked think that's politically necessary for the U.S. to do anything national and serious about climate change. Politics in Congress don't support that happening directly. So instead, there are many less efficient tools that are going to be used. They're still effective. They're just more costly than a national homogeneous policy. So they may start to take a lot of bite, but the politics of what's going to happen are hard to predict.
Okay, a last quick, please.
Even independent of competitiveness or like kind of policies and how this affects competitiveness, also just like, making sure that you're fulfilling consumer expectations will be really important. And we see that those are increasing already today, similar to the expectation of investors. They want to know what companies' plans are and if they're equipped to handle the financial consequences of potentially, climate change events. And so I feel that even today, there is already a benefit of investing into some of those measures. And there are multiple examples that show that sometimes the sustainable business lines of certain companies are growing faster and are more successful than maybe their traditional product lines. Independent of those policies, I would also encourage to think companies about kind of these perspectives and how they can leverage those developments as well.
Right. So not all change has to come from government. It can come from the private sector as well. A very useful reminder. All right. With that, our time has run out, although not the interesting topics we could address. But let me sincerely thank both Joe and Susie for sharing their insights on this important topic. To the audience, let me note that an on-demand version of the webinar will be available shortly afterwards and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. We would encourage you to save your spot for the next State of Trade webinar, which will be on April 21st. There's a button in the top right that lets you do that. And let me just thank you all for joining us, and please stay safe. Thank you.